The Earth is in crisis. All around us, we are witnessing the collapse of Western civilization. And what is the catalyst for this collapse? The death of God. The stone which the builders rejected once became the cornerstone of our civilization. But now we dig at our foundation and see in dismay that this great castle which we have built has no cornerstone at all. Our civilization was founded upon the belief in God. Our laws, our social contracts, our understanding of history and of our destiny, our very understanding of what it means to be human, are all founded upon faith in the Christian God. And without this belief, everything goes. Nietzsche sums up the gravity of our situation well in the Gay Science. Now that this faith has been undermined, how much must collapse because it was built on this faith, leaned on it? For example, our entire European morality. This long, dense succession of demolition, destruction, downfall, upheaval that now stands ahead. Who would guess enough of it today to play the teacher and herald of this monstrous logic of horror, the prophet of deep darkness and an eclipse of the sun, the like of which has never before existed on earth? Well, Nietzsche was that prophet of darkness. He saw this catastrophic collapse coming, the total eclipse of Western civilization. He was before his time, but now this collapse is apparent all around us. Some place their hopes on a separation from society, some sort of breakaway community. They are like the saint in the woods at the beginning of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who does not yet know that God is dead. Some righteously defend the old morals and sentiments. They are like the Roman aristocracy clinging to their old gods when the new god had already been born. Those who cling to the corpse of Western civilization will perish. They seek to defend this corpse from scavengers and predators, but the West already lays rotting in the hot sun like a beached whale. Western culture is already dead. We can smell the rot all around us and see the flies thickening the air. The best we can hope to do is to resurrect the spirit of our father which is trapped in its belly. But as of now, nothing is being done towards this end. It is not our spirit which is ascendant. In the wake of the collapse of the old world order, the transhumanists seek to fill the power vacuum. They see the same problem that we do, but they are of a fundamentally different type, and thus their solution, the expression of their will to power, is fundamentally different and opposed to ours. Klaus Schwab, foremost among the transhumanists, imagines a future in which mass man is highly regulated, and a global conglomerate of transnational corporations serves to rule over and regulate humanity. He views himself and those of his type as the ones who will shepherd humanity into a transhumanist future, in which the biological and technological worlds will merge to form a smoothly running and highly regulated machine. Nietzsche predicted such a future. He believed that the New World Order would bring about a leveling of mass man into one obedient, mindless herd, a sickly herd with no creative energy or will. We already see this happening all around us. We must face the stark reality of our situation. Most people will not make it. Most people will become the chattel of the state without resistance, even happily. They are easily manipulated and led by the tarantulas who use Enlightenment values to clothe their will to power in a veil of virtue. The preachers of equality, as Nietzsche called them. Nietzsche believed that mass man would go down a path of ever-increasing mediocrity and increasing sickness of body and spirit until he degenerated into a barely conscious creature of the type seen in 1984 and Brave New World. Nietzsche called this type of man the last man. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes this last man. No shepherd, one herd. Everybody wants the same, and everybody is the same. Whoever thinks differently goes voluntarily into the madhouse. Formerly, all the world was insane, say the most subtle of them, and they blink. One is clever and knows everything that has ever happened, so there is no end of derision. One has one's little pleasure for the day and one's little pleasure for the night, but one has a regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink. As mankind becomes increasingly integrated with the machinery of economy and state, he will become a mere cog in a giant clockwork. Man himself will become a machine, a worker drone, in a vast superstructure which is beyond his comprehension. This mechanized mankind is Schwab's vision for the future, the so-called integration of the digital and biological spheres. But the situation is not hopeless. Nietzsche believed that the collapse of Western civilization and the leveling of mass man would give the opportunity for a higher type of man to arise who manages to preserve himself apart from the herd and not become a sickly, demoralized cog in the machine. Nietzsche addressed his books to these men who have the will and daring to rise to the challenge of the death of God and transform themselves into something greater. For this reason, Nietzsche viewed the collapse of our civilization with hope. He writes, "The consequences for ourselves are the opposite of what one might expect. Not at all sad and gloomy, but much more like a new and barely describable type of light. Happiness, relief, amusement, encouragement, dawn. Indeed, at hearing the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel illuminated by a new dawn. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, foreboding, expectation. Finally, the horizon seems clear again, even if not bright. Finally, our ships may set out again, set out to face any danger. Every daring of the lover of knowledge is allowed again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Maybe there has never been such an open sea. Destruction always paves the way for new growth. Our civilization is in decline. Our culture has become decadent, and we have become nihilistic and lethargic. Most of us no longer have the will to create. We are demoralized and resigned to a dystopian future. But for the few who still have the daring, energy, will, and desire for danger which is present in all healthy spirits, the collapse of our civilization signals a new dawn. Those who have lost the will to live see nothing but darkness and gloom on all sides. But we free spirits see this as an opportunity to embark on the greatest adventure in human history. If we are up to the task, we have the unique opportunity to create something completely new. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spake Zarathustra, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Our challenge is to become worthy of the death of God. With God dead, we must now turn our eyes to man. What does it mean to be human without God? What is man? What shall man become? These are all questions which Klaus Schwab is asking and answering in a serious and actionable way. But we are revolted by the transhumanists because their solution to the challenges of modernity are fundamentally nihilistic. Their instinct is a leveling instinct, the instinct to make small, to homogenize, to regulate, to make things safe and sterile, to nullify all dangers. They reject this world and the body and seek to transcend them by creating an artificial world into which we can escape. In contrast, Nietzsche's solution represents a fully human future. We understand that mankind must fundamentally change in order to adapt to the challenges of modernity, but we seek to do this by improving ourselves, not making our environment safe or escaping our reality. We put our faith in this world and in our bodies. We seek to confront danger head-on with daring and tenacity. We remain faithful to the earth and to our bodies, which have been crafted over thousands of years of evolution and which contain the whole history of mankind within them. And this vision of the future, which encourages human flourishing and excellence, gives us hope. We few who are still creative spirits, we who still have chaos in our souls, see the potential for the creation of something great, for the transformation of man into something sacred, into a work of art. We are given the chance to be like Prometheus, far thinkers and daring creators, and to sculpt something out of ourselves which will justify mankind's bloody and treacherous journey up to this point. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Behold, what fullness is around us, and from amid this superabundance it is delightful to look out upon distant seas." Once people said God when they looked out upon distant seas, but now I have taught you to say Overman. God is a conjecture, but I do not wish that your conjecturing reach beyond your creating will. Could you create a God? Then I urge you, be silent about all gods. But you could well create the Overman. Perhaps not you yourselves, my brothers, but you could transform yourselves into fathers and forefathers of the Overman, and let that be your best creating. But, as Jordan Peterson likes to harp on, we can't just arbitrarily shape ourselves into the Superman out of thin air. The creation of a higher type of man will take time and requires a sturdy foundation. It is our task to create the framework and the foundation for the creation of a higher type of human being. Nietzsche was the first to embark on this task, which he called the transvaluation of all values. We can no longer rely on the values of the West to protect us. Who can sincerely call on God and invoke natural rights when their tweet is censored on Twitter? When Klaus Schwab says, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," who can sincerely respond, "But wait, you can't force me into a pod. God gave me the right to own property." To create something new, we need fresh values which are still full of energy and creative potential. We need a framework for looking at the world which is powerful and which inspires, one which can compete with the transhumanist vision for the future. And it is our task to create this framework. This means that we must look back at all of history and reconsider what is valuable to us and what will serve to carry us into the future. We must test everything with a hammer and see what is strong. This is a demanding task and a harsh one, for much needs to be discarded. This is the transvaluation of all values. Nietzsche provided the critical foundation for thinking pragmatically about the future, but did not get to complete the transvaluation of all values. This will be the aim of my new video series. We will explore the foundational myths and stories of our civilization in an attempt to abstract new values, and at the same time, ancient values, and understand our position in history. I believe that the life of the modern man is still full of mythological and religious meaning, perhaps even more so than ever before. and we need only look to our most ancient myths to uncover this well of meaning. We are like Noah before the flood. It is our task to decide what is valuable to us and what will survive the deluge. And once we have salvaged everything we can from the wreckage of Western civilization, and the flood has passed, we can begin to build the foundations of new structures with our ancient building blocks, structures which will last centuries to come. At the center of all creation, there stands a sacred tree. From its roots spring the waters of life, and from its branches hang the fruit of life. When man was fresh sprung from the earth, he stood before this tree in the midst of God's sacred garden, naked, proud, and unashamed. Woman stood by man's side, and they were joined in flesh and spirit. Each was an image of physical perfection, God's best work. Beauty, nobility, and grace radiated from them, and where their bare feet tread, the earth rejoiced. They took freely of the fruits of God's garden, and lived in companionship with the animals, ruling mildly over them. They lived as one with the will of life, abiding by the laws of God, which he had set down in his creation. Theirs was a pure life and a true life. They lived with nothing concealed and nothing restrained. The unbridled expression of the will to life flowed through them, and they walked with God. There was only one condition for their carefree existence.
If you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be separated from the other animals and from me, and you will no longer be able to eat freely from the tree of life, for you will know death, and you will fear death, and death will haunt you all the days of your life, and follow you in the fields like a shadow.
Now the serpent was of all the animals the most clever and wise. The other animals relied on brotherhood for sustenance and protection, but the serpent had no companions. He went alone on his belly through the grass, and learned to make his means with trickery and deceit, and this had made him wise. And seeing him to be the wisest of all the animals, God appointed him to guard the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One day the serpent spoke to Eve as she tended the garden.
If you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, it will be a sin against God and nature, but you will be then as a god, knowing good and evil, and you will rule over all of nature, and your eyes will be opened.
And Eve, an innocent and honest animal, like helpless prey, was coiled in his clever words, and seeing the serpent wise, and enraptured by his glittering scales, she ate of the fruit, and Adam too ate. Now Adam and Eve knew good and evil, and their eyes were opened. The future stretched before them, an uncertain chasm. They knew pain, and they knew death, and time no longer seemed like an infinite stretch of days and nights. And God cast them out of the garden from which they sprung, saying,
Now the woman will be pained in childbirth, and cling unto her husband, and the man shall till the fields in the hot sun all the days of his life.
And they were separated from God, and from the animals, and from the pure expression of life. And no longer could they eat freely of the fruit of God's garden, for they knew evil and deceit. My source for this retelling was the King James translation of Genesis 1-3. In this video, we will examine this story from psychological, evolutionary, and symbolic perspectives in an attempt to abstract our new values in the context of modernity. But first, we must address the traditional Christian interpretation of Genesis. We reject the traditional Christian interpretation of Genesis as nihilistic because it views life itself as a catastrophe. It puts forth the valuation that death and suffering are mistakes, punishments. It renounces this world and the body as corrupted, sinful, and fundamentally unnatural. This interpretation stems from the Christian instinct for the renunciation of this world, for a better, idealized world, which is absent hardship. We reject the interpretation of the theft of knowledge as a sin or a moral evil. We also reject the interpretation that eating of the apple of knowledge was an act of lust. Nietzsche, who viewed the Christian worldview as nihilistic and anti-life, writes, "It was Christianity with its heartfelt resentment against life that first made something unclean of sexuality. It threw filth on the origin, on the essential fact of our life." We view sexuality as the drive to create life, not a sin against it. And we strongly reject the association of sin, suffering, and death with the body. In fact, we reject any moral interpretation of this story and understand it instead as descriptive. On the most basic level, Genesis 1 through 3 is a description of man's coming to consciousness and subsequent loss of the paradisal animal state of existence. In Eden, man lived in union with nature and God. Man was beyond good and evil, living that noble, unashamed, instinctual life of animals. The expression of his instincts was pure, without resentment, deceit, or shame. Man was not capable of evil in the same way that a lion is not capable of evil. But the acquisition of higher consciousness turned man against nature and against the animal in himself, against his own instincts. After eating of the fruit of knowledge, man becomes acutely aware of pain, death, and suffering. He is able to place the framework of good and evil over the amoral reality of nature. Death and suffering are evil, he says. With his increased self-awareness, man becomes ridden with guilt and shame, no longer able to express his instincts with the purity of an animal. He becomes ashamed of his instincts and learns to hide himself from nature, from God. Where he once followed the will of nature without hesitation or self-reflection, he now learns deceit, concealment, and disobedience. Nietzsche writes, "We no longer trace the origin of the human being in spirit, in divinity. We have placed it back among the animals, and even in asserting that, we assert too much. The human being is, relatively speaking, the most bungled of all the animals, the sickliest, the most dangerously strayed from its instincts. But for all that, he is of course the most interesting." With the acquisition of higher consciousness, man becomes wise, but also wicked and deceitful. He acquires the worst sickness, dissatisfaction with life, resentment against being, and shame at his own existence. After the fall, man begins to turn against his own nature, which he is ashamed of and seeks to restrain. Thus, the process of the domestication, the weakening and sickening of man begins, a process which has been dramatically accelerated by the innovations of industrial society. Nietzsche writes, "To call the taming of an animal its improvement is in our ears almost a joke. Whoever knows what goes on in menageries is doubtful whether the beasts in them are improved. They are weakened, they are made less harmful, they become sickly beasts. It is no different with the tamed human being." Nietzsche renounced Christianity because it seeks to further the taming of man and the subversion of his nature. Yet here we find ourselves in agreement with the Christian interpretation that a return to Eden is in fact desired. Nietzsche called such a return the reanimalization of man. Man's fall from the animal state, though a necessary trade-off for the advantages which higher consciousness provides, was a tragedy and a rebellion against God and nature which introduced sin, that is, shame and guilt, into the world. Nietzsche writes, "Error has transformed animals into men. Is truth perhaps capable of changing man back into an animal?" Nietzsche believed that the reanimalization of man was a necessary counterforce to the degenerative forces of modernity. Mankind, which, since the fall, has lived in an anti-natural state, must now aspire to acquire again the nobility, amorality, and pure expression of life and the instincts which is extant in nature. Man must aspire to rid himself of sin, shame, guilt, repression, and self-hatred, and dare to venture beyond good and evil. Only then can man transform himself into a higher, healthier animal. The reanimalized man, the higher man, affirms life and exalts life despite suffering. He no longer labels death and suffering as evil, but embraces them as part of life. To summarize, we view Genesis 1 through 3 as a symbolic description of man's acquisition of higher consciousness and fall from the animal state, a tale of the first great transformation of mankind, a tale of how we became human. And this brings us to the evolutionary perspective. Jordan Peterson has covered this topic fairly extensively, but I wanted to briefly review how the story of Eden maps onto the evolutionary history of mankind. Our frontal cortex, which is in large part responsible for our greater cognitive abilities as compared with other animals, is where we process ideas of good and evil, right and wrong. It is also what allows us to inhibit our more ancient instincts and drives which stem from the amygdala, the so-called lizard brain. The development of our large frontal cortex is linked with our increased dependence on eyesight, which evolved in part to detect snakes and ripe fruit, or more simply, food and predators. Additionally, our small pelvises, which resulted from walking on our hind legs, is what makes childbirth much more dangerous and painful for humans as compared with chimps and other animals. It also makes sense evolutionarily that women are the origin of shame, since women make men self-conscious. Women drive the evolutionary arms race for intelligence. Women inspire men to compete, to build, to create, and to better our species. Just as nature transforms animals through natural selection and decides who is worthy to carry on the torch of life, women transform our species through sexual selection by choosing which men are worthy of reproducing. Thus, Eve is both the protagonist of Genesis and the catalyst of our fall. She is the first Prometheus, both a thief and a champion of knowledge, both a sinner and a savior. The story of Eden can also be interpreted as a description of our fall from the free and natural hunter-gatherer way of life and entry into agricultural society where men are doomed to till the earth and women are restricted to the domestic. Much of our suffering comes from not being able to accept our nature. This is Jung's idea of integrating the shadow. We are no longer evolved to our environments. We are like animals in a zoo, and thus we suffer from our own nature. Nietzsche describes the origin of this suffering in the genealogy of morals. The man who is forced into an oppressive narrowness and regularity of custom impatiently tore himself apart, persecuted himself, gnawed away at himself, grew upset, and did himself damage. With him was introduced the greatest and strangest illness, from which today human beings have not recovered. The suffering of man from his own nature, from himself, a consequence of the forcible separation from his animal past, a declaration of war against the old instincts on which his power, joy, and ability to inspire fear had been based. In agricultural society, and even more so in industrial society, we are no longer evolved to our environment as we were when we lived in a tribal, hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In order to take up the challenge of modernity and transform ourselves into something greater in an environment which is increasingly toxic and promotes illness and weakness, we must make peace with our own nature and come to love our nature. Only then can we aspire to new heights, Nietzsche writes. You aspire to free heights. Your soul thirsts for the stars, but your wicked instincts too thirst for freedom. Your wild dogs want freedom. They bark with joy in their cellar when your spirit plans to open all prisons. We must uncage and forgive these wild dogs. They have too long been abused and been turned into savage, starving creatures by this abuse. Now we must reconcile ourselves with them. We must come to view our instincts and passions as fundamentally good, as nature's guides for us, as her very will, and harness their power for the act of creation. And finally, let us look at the symbolic meaning of Genesis 1 through 3. Snakes and trees are two of the most common symbolic motifs. This may be because we co-evolved with them and they are permanently impressed upon our biology. Snakes often appear as creatures of transformation, healing, knowledge, and self-transcendence. Those who adventure into greater speculation believe that the symbol of the two intertwined snakes may be an unconscious, instinctual representation of the structure of DNA. Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins recently had a debate about this subject. Peterson, of course, defending it, and Dawkins claiming that the idea is absolute rubbish. However, I do not find the idea that the most basic structures of life are revealed in religious symbolism to be far-fetched. The tree of life is another example of a mythological motif found in almost every religion and culture. The structure of a tree follows one of the most basic patterns of nature, the river fractal. The nervous systems of vertebrate organisms, the literal trees of life at the center of our bodies, are structured like this fractal. Look at our circulatory and respiratory systems. Look at the structure of rivers and plants. Now, look at a diagram representing evolution. As life moves from generation to generation, and thus conquers death, it is forming a fractal pattern across time. All of life forms a tree-shaped fractal. All of life is part of one tree of life, whose roots reach into the very depths of the earth and the divine. The will of life, the will of nature, the will of God are the sap of this tree, for they are all one will, and they flow through you. You are life's vessel to the next generation. To your DNA, you are like the skin of a snake, which is shed each generation as life transforms itself in the struggle against death and entropy. Your DNA holds the most ancient secret knowledge of life. Your DNA guards the tree of life. To conclude, Genesis can be understood as a description and symbolic representation of the first major event in the history of mankind, the first psychological and biological transformation of our species, the very dawn of human consciousness. By stealing knowledge from the divine, Eve fundamentally altered what it means to be human and created man as we know him. Eve is the mother of mankind, the author of our greatest woes, but also the giver of our greatest gift. From this story, we may take three essential principles. Our first principle, that suffering and death are not evil. Rather, Acute awareness of them is the price we must pay for higher consciousness. This higher consciousness has introduced shame, guilt, resentment, and deceit into the world, and thereby separated us from nature and God. But this is where our second principle comes in, that our instincts are not evil. We can and should aspire to live in union with nature and God through the proper expression of the instincts and the will to life. By disciplining and harnessing our instincts, we can aspire towards that noble existence of the lion who embraces life with all of his being, without resentment and without shame. And our third principle, that all of life is part of one tree and one will. The tree of life is nature's will projected through time in its struggle against entropy. God is life. Our bodies are the vessels which bear that life from generation to generation, and in doing so, transform it. Our bodies are the temple of that life, and we are that life, that will to power, to thriving, to overcoming, that will to create, to transcend. Adam and Eve bore two sons, the elder Cain and the younger Abel. Abel was a shepherd. Like a lion, he strode boldly beside his flock. Soon the wolves learned to fear his roar and his club. He followed his herd wherever they wandered, sleeping under the stars and killing his food with spear or stone. Abel's belly was ever full, and he grew strong and hearty from his diet of game, dairy, and foraged berries. Cain was a farmer. He worked the fields in the hot sun and labored even harder than his brother Abel. But sometimes the crops failed. Sometimes disease took them, or wild animals ravaged them. And Cain, who had lived his life protected by the fences of the farm, had not developed the courage or strength to fend off the wild animals. He often went hungry, and his diet of grains and vegetables left him weak and vulnerable to disease. Abel always provided Adam and Eve with plentiful food and clothed them with wool and hides. But Cain often had nothing to offer his parents. Abel always burned fatty cuts of meat on his altars to God, and poured out libations of rich milk, berries, and honey. But Cain's altars smoldered with empty husks and rotten vegetables. In all ways, God favored Abel, and so did Adam and Eve. Therefore, resentment coiled in Cain's stomach like a serpent, and one day he lay on his belly in the grass, waiting for his brother to come back to the fields to sacrifice. And when his brother knelt down in prayer, Cain rose from the grass and struck him down with a stone. Abel's body fell dead, and Cain's crops were watered with the blood of his brother. And Cain knew that he had destroyed something beautiful and good, but his heart had become proud and bitter, and he would not repent. So Cain became a fugitive on the earth, hiding in the shadows and dwelling in caves, fearful of his fellow man and of God. The descendants of Cain are of the serpent's breed and go cunningly in the shadows, but the descendants of Abel are of the lion's breed and walk boldly in the light. And so are the generations of Cain and the generations of Abel forever at war. And Adam and Eve had a third son, Seth. Seth was a pious man. He had not been gifted with the courage of Abel or the cunning of Cain, but his spirit was heavy with wisdom, and his vision was clear and far-shooting. And God said to Seth,
"Hold back your generations from the generations of Cain, and keep them aloof on your holy mountain. For if your generations mix with the generations of Cain, there will be a curse upon you and your generations, and the serpent will forever walk among you and bite at your heels."
But Seth could not keep his generations back, and they descended into the valleys and mixed with the blood of Cain. No longer did the generations of Cain have to dwell in caves in fear of the generations of Abel. for now they could conceal themselves among the generations of Seth, and pass their cunning as spiritual wisdom. And from out of the generations of Seth, the descendants of Cain have waged a secret war upon the descendants of Abel, not a war of spears and swords, but of deception and subversion, of truth and lies. Resentment. It creeps upon you like a plague. Slowly, bit by bit, it eats away at you like rot, poisoning your soul and turning your heart against life itself. The story of Cain and Abel, on one level, is an explanation of the psychological phenomena of resentment and revenge. It further expands upon the consequences of the fall, namely, that some are able to maintain a free, prelapsarian state of living, in harmony with nature and in alignment with their own nature, while others are not. Abel lives a natural, free, untroubled life, wandering the pastures with his flock. Cain, however, must devote his days to intense labor and live in servitude to the earth. Abel grows strong from his diet and the elements. The wild beasts test his courage and strengthen his virtue. Cain grows weak from his diet. His courage and his instincts atrophy from lack of use. While Abel lives in the moment, guided by his instincts, Cain must learn to think only for the future. For Abel, life is free and good. For Cain, life is suffering and labor. Therefore, Cain becomes resentful against life, and moreover against Abel, who does not suffer from life, and who finds freedom and joy where Cain finds suffering and servitude. Cain begins to hate Abel, who embodies health, beauty, and strength, all the virtues which nature favors and rewards. Cain hates life, and plots his vengeance against life. He seeks to exact revenge on God and nature, since they cruelly favor Abel, and unfairly punish him. Nietzsche believed that resentment is the symptom of a sick animal. All living creatures seek to expend their energy and exert their will upon the world. This is the will to power. This is the most fundamental law of life. If one's instincts have no outlet, as is the case with the repressed and over-socialized, they fester into resentment. This is why the hatred and resentment which drive serial killers to murder often stems from profound feelings of impotence. If one is unable to express their will to life, like a caged animal, they turn feral and are seized by the bloodlust of vengeance.
Why did you actually kill the girls?
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships.
The instincts, when they are not expressed, become a source of tremendous, violent energy. Throughout history, warriors and shamans have used various ascetic practices to cultivate and repurpose the energy of the instincts. However, when the restriction of the instincts stems not from a strength of will and discipline, but from impotence and weakness, the instincts turn against life itself and become destructive.
I was raging inside. There was just incredible energies, positive and negative.
Nietzsche believed that there are two essential attitudes towards life which one can take: affirmation and denial, and that these attitudes stem from the health or sickness, the weakness or strength of an individual. One's relationship with one's instincts, one's health, is what creates the divide between the noble and the ignoble, the life affirmers and deniers, the Abels and the Cains. Nietzsche writes, "While the noble man lives in trust and openness with himself, the man of resentment is neither upright nor naive, nor honest and straightforward with himself. His soul squints, his spirit loves hiding places, secret paths, and back doors. Everything covert entices him, as his world, his security, his refreshment. He understands how to keep silent and how not to forget, how to wait, how to be provisionally self-deprecating and humble. A race of such men of resentment is bound to become eventually cleverer than any noble race. It will also honor cleverness to a far greater degree, namely as a condition of existence of the first importance. Resentment itself, if it should appear in the noble man, consummates and exhausts itself in an immediate reaction, and therefore does not poison. On the other hand, it fails to appear at all on countless occasions on which it inevitably appears in the weak and impotent. The repression of the instincts makes us self-conscious, clever, and wicked, as we discussed in the previous video on Genesis. Civilization, up until this point, has been a process of the increasing internalization of man, the increasing repression of our instincts, and therefore the heightening of our cleverness and internalized consciousness. In modern industrial society, we have become over-socialized and repressed. Like animals in a zoo, we suffer terribly from our own nature. And this brings us to the initially opaque, evolutionary, or historical meaning of the story of Cain and Abel. Nietzsche believed that all great civilizations are founded by an aggressive, untamed people which is still in touch with its instincts and with nature, a healthy people which has the unspent energy and strength of will to fully affirm life. It is no coincidence that Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd. The greatest conquests in history were carried out by pastoralists upon agriculturalist populations, such as the Indo-European conquest of the native European population. The Indo-Europeans were horse-riding, warlike pastoralists originating in the Russian steppes. We know from their skeletons that they were bigger and stronger than the native European farmers, who suffered the ails of agricultural living, namely poor nutrition and disease. The Indo-Europeans lived a free, nomadic lifestyle and had a diet rich in dairy and meat. The Russian steppes are a harsh environment, and it likely shaped them into a rugged and courageous people. They tore through Europe, slaughtering and conquering, making it all the way to the farthest reaches of the north and as far east as India. Again and again, history has shown that the nomadic pastoralist lifestyle and diet create fierce and hearty peoples, while early agricultural populations were left open to the perils of plague, poor diet, and enslavement. In this context, the story of Cain and Abel might also be understood as an allegory for the victory of the agricultural way of life over the nomadic one. This is all to say that lifestyle, diet, and health shape the morality of individuals and peoples. This is why Nietzsche believed that thriving cultures begin with a healthy body and properly ordered instincts. He writes, "In Athens, Cicero expresses his surprise that the men and youths were by far superior to the women in beauty. But what work and effort the male sex had demanded of itself for centuries there in the service of beauty. For one must not be mistaken about the method here. Merely training one's feelings and thoughts is worth practically nil. First, one must convince the body. It is decisive for the lot of a people and of humanity that one begin culture in the right place, not in the soul, as was the fatal superstition of the priests and semi-priests. The right place is the body, demeanor, diet, physiology, and the rest is a consequence. For this reason, the Greeks are still the first cultural event of history. They knew, they did what was needed. The body is the soil from which virtue, morality, and culture grow. Great cultures do not spontaneously blossom out of thin air. They are the result of a virtue, discipline, lifestyle, and physicality which has been cultivated and sculpted over a long period of time. And yet, as a civilization becomes wealthy and its people become comfortable, They lose touch with their instincts, and their civilization degenerates into decadence. Its people become sickly, over-socialized, and nihilistic, until it is eventually conquered by a culture which still has energy, will, and health. This is exactly what the Romans did to the Greeks, and the Germanic tribes, in turn, did to the Romans. Our civilization is now in a decadent cycle. At the head of our institutions and political bodies, leading our culture, are the transhumanists. They reject the body and lead a war against it. They reject biology and nature and seek to transcend them. The body is life. A culture or ideology which despises the body despises life. The transhumanists are life haters and deniers. They use glittering words, justice, equality, progress, to hide their secret resentment against life and against all that is beautiful and good. Their words may be enticing and noble, but their bodies betray them. Their sickly, pale visages and shrunken forms reveal the rot of their souls. In their hearts, it is their secret desire to be tyrants, judges, and executioners, and to thus exact their vengeance upon the world. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Thus I speak to you in parable, you who make souls whirl, you preachers of equality. To me you are tarantulas, and secretly vengeful. Therefore I tear at your webs, that your rage may lure you out of your lie holes, and your revenge may leap out from behind your word, justice. For that man be delivered from revenge is for me the bridge to the highest hope, and a rainbow after long storms." The tarantulas, the life-haters, are the descendants of Cain, passing themselves off as wise leaders. They are the serpents who eventually corrupt all institutions because they have a mind for waiting and scheming. Since they cannot interact with the world honestly, they take the thinker's path and use tools of manipulation and subversion to assert their will upon the world. If there is anything akin to original sin in our new value system, it is resentment, which is, most fundamentally, denial of life and subversion of the instincts and the will to life. Resentment lurks in all of us, the impulse to deny life when we are confronted with suffering, the impulse to hate those who are favored by nature or fortune. The great danger of the descendants of Seth, those gifted with intellectual and spiritual insight, is that they become entrapped in the thinker's web and become creatures of resentment, like Dostoevsky's Underground Man. The great danger of the descendants of Abel, those gifted with physical grace and strength, is that they let others think for them and are led to their own destruction by the life-haters. In an unnatural environment such as ours, one cannot rely on instinct and physicality alone. One must also have the correct first principles and values. Yet if one seeks to navigate life on principle and intellect alone, as is so common in our age, and does not develop their physicality or hone their instincts, their principles will fail and mislead them. To embrace life fully and embrace the body fully is to cure yourself of resentment. We must recognize that some are favored by nature and by fortune, but that we all have the divine will of life within us. We must not resent those who are more beautiful, stronger, or more fortunate than us, but rather view them as ideals to strive for. Resentment is a symptom of illness. Virtue and culture begin in the body, in the instincts, in health. To have a healthy body and a healthy relationship with the instincts, and thus with nature and life itself, is to create the soil for beautiful things to grow. From a sick tree grows poisonous fruit. From a healthy tree grows the fruit of life. We should aspire to live like lions, courageous, untroubled, going boldly across the plains, fearful of none, like far-sighted eagles, soaring high above the mountains, aloof and discerning. We should aspire to embody the nobility and grace exemplified in nature's creations. Prometheus, sculptor of man, far-seer and foreseer, stealer of fire, teacher of the arts and sciences. You saw mankind groveling in the mud and filth like animals, their spirit broken, and you could not bear to see it. You mustered your clever will, your transgressive, creative will, and stole fire from shining Zeus. Enlightener, patron of mankind, you lifted us from the mud and taught us the arts of civilization and high culture. You showed us what it is to live freely and nobly again. You opened our eyes. You gave us the power of gods. While the Genesis myth demonstrated the price we pay for higher consciousness and the state of paradise which we lost in its acquisition, the Prometheus myth shows us that higher consciousness is also a divine gift. From this myth, we might even posit a life-affirming transhumanism, a transhumanism of the kind which Nietzsche imagined in his Overman. Nietzsche believed that the story of the fall was life-denying because it represents suffering as an error committed by Eve through passive folly. He contrasted this with the active sin which Prometheus commits by stealing fire from Zeus. Nietzsche writes, "The presupposition of the Prometheus myth is to be found in the extravagant value which naive humanity attached to fire as the true palladium of every ascending culture, but that man should freely dispose of fire without receiving it as a present from heaven, either as a lightning bolt or the warming rays of the sun, struck these reflective, primitive men as sacrilege, as a robbery of divine nature." Thus, the very first philosophical problem immediately produces a painful and irresolvable contradiction between man and God, and moves it before the gate of every culture like a huge boulder. The best and highest possession which mankind can acquire is obtained by sacrilege and must be paid for with consequences that involve the whole flood of sufferings and sorrows with which the offended divinities have to afflict the nobly aspiring race of men. This is a harsh idea, which by the dignity it confers on sacrilege contrasts strangely with the myth of the fall, in which curiosity, mendaciousness, deception, susceptibility to seduction, lust, in short, a series of preeminently feminine affects, was considered the origin of evil. What distinguishes the Greek notion is the sublime view of active sin as the characteristically Promethean virtue. With that, the ethical basis for pessimistic tragedy has been found, the justification of human evil, meaning both human guilt and the human suffering it entails. In the first video in this series, we reinterpreted the fall as active and life-affirming, and interpreted Eve's theft of knowledge as a Promethean act. But even with this reinterpretation, the story of the fall highlights the suffering which higher consciousness brought upon us by separating us from our instincts and from nature. Prometheus redeems this suffering and justifies the price we pay for knowledge. In this way, Nietzsche's point stands. While Genesis highlighted the role of the feminine in our evolutionary history, the myth of Prometheus highlights the role of the masculine will to power and justifies Eve's theft of knowledge. Mastering fire allowed our ancestors to cook meat, which likely contributed to the rapid growth of our brains. Mastering fire gave us a source of warmth, which allowed us to conquer the cold and migrate to the northern hemisphere. Fire allowed us to forge more powerful weapons and tools from bronze and iron. In short, Fire unlocked everything we needed to create high civilization. The towers and spires of cities which reach towards the lofty clouds, the revelations of artistic vision, the innovations of science, even the shining bronze and plumed helmets of heroic warfare were created by our Promethean will to rise above our condition. Prometheus teaches us that life is not survival alone. In us and in all life, there is a divine fire, a will to transcend, a will to overcome, to progress, towards what end only nature knows. The flame of life does not smolder and sputter meekly in our hearts. It hungers for the heights, for the ecstasy and frenzy of creation, and for the exaltation of the created. With the acquisition of higher consciousness depicted in Genesis, our species lost the blissful and ignorant state of instinctual animal living, and with Cain's conquest of Abel, we lost also the nomadic, pastoralist lifestyle which most closely resembled our pre-human, hunter-gatherer existence in nature. Agricultural living is by default filthy, lowly, and crushingly oppressive. The historical life of the farmer has often been no better than that of the beasts which he drives. As much as he has domesticated his animals and broken their will, they have domesticated him and broken his. His skin is scabbed from flea bites, his joints ache from arthritis, his teeth are decaying from poor nutrition. He is a man broken from labor and ridden by disease. With the paradise of nature lost to us, we need civilization to sustain the freedom and health which we once enjoyed in nature. The conditions of high culture, of art and science, require the Promethean will, the will to test oneself against the gods and steal power from them with daring and cunning. But life in ascent is rare, and always there is the pull of the insectile life of the anthill. As we discussed in the first video of this series, we are in an age where the Western will is weak and atrophied, and the pull of the mindless, bug-man living which the transhumanists and techies champion seems almost irresistible. We are dragged, as if by a strong tide, towards a drugged stupor, a necrotic sleep from which we may never awake. And all the while, gaunt cronies and would-be tyrants dream of leaving humanity behind for a world of machines. But from amid this damp fog of modern life, Nietzsche saw the fire of a distant god descending from Olympus, a great giver of gifts, a creator, a being of terrible will and tremendous power. He writes, "Our psychologists, whose glance lingers involuntarily on symptoms of decadence alone, again and again induce us to mistrust the spirit. One always sees only those effects of the spirit that make men weak, delicate, and morbid. But now there are coming new barbarians, cynics, experimenters, conquerors, a union of spiritual superiority with well-being and an excess of strength. I point to something new. Certainly, for such a democratic type, there exists the danger of the barbarian, but one has looked for it only in the depths. There exists also another type of barbarian who comes from the heights, a species of conquering and ruling natures in search of material to mold. Prometheus was this kind of barbarian. Ascendant life requires room to experiment, and a diversity of ways of being which is not possible in the dull, homogenized, default state of agricultural and industrial society. We need fresh air and clear views to see life not as a rat race for survival through claustrophobic city streets and droning subway systems, but as art, as life for life's sake. This is the original purpose of the liberal arts, to educate yourself not out of necessity, but for enrichment. This is also the original purpose of the gymnasium, to train your body not for functionality, but in the pursuit of beauty. The holistic education of body and mind, and the refinement and enrichment of the human being in pursuit of a higher ideal, is only possible because civilization creates enough distance from mere survival to treat man as an experiment and an artistic creation. In this context, a positive transhumanism is possible. As the old structures and institutions of our civilization crumble and the elite die off, new barbarians will arise who have the will to revitalize our culture and take on the most daring task of all, the creation of a higher type of human being. Do you understand that man is both the sculptor and the sculpted? That man is a creation of his own imagination and his own hands? Then you well could be one of these barbarians from the heights, and you know well the great task which lies before us. Our flesh is the raw clay which we set out to sculpt into a creature of terrible beauty, nobility, and power, and for this tremendous task we need daring of will, sharpness of mind, and strength of body. I see this superior creature now, standing on a sun-washed beach, looking upon distant shores. Its delicate yet brutal features cast no shadow in the high noon. Its body is poised, taut, ready to spring, to leap, to dance. This is our transhumanist vision. It is not the flaccid transhumanism of cold machines and lifeless silicon which springs from the purple lips of our geriatric demagogues. Our transhumanism is a philosophy of flesh and fire. Man is a creator, and in creating he redeems himself. By continually overcoming himself and seeking out new heights and depths of spirit and body, man justifies himself. By testing his will against gods and monsters, the ancient man recreated himself in the image of their beauty and power. By testing ourselves against the ideal of the overman, we recreate ourselves in his image, and this will be our best creating. What would there be to create if there were gods? My will to create impels me again and again towards man. Thus the hammer is impelled towards the stone. Within the stone sleeps an image, the image of my visions. Alas, that it slumbers in the hardest, ugliest stone. Now my hammer rages ruthlessly against its prison. From the stone fly the fragments. What is that to me? I want to perfect it, for a shadow came to me. The stillest and lightest of all things once came to me. The beauty of the Superman came to me as a shadow. O my brothers, of what account are the gods to me now? Thus spake Zarathustra.